nuclear power. So you need very intrusive verification means, and we spell out in this I won't get into now the ways that you can do that. We know how to do it. It's not like something has to be invented. It's just a question of countries agreeing to do that. You also need a good governing mechanism. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which now verifies the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has very limited powers. It can't put sanctions on a country. It has to go to the UN Security Council. And since the 5 declared nuclear weapon states have veto power in the Security Council, you can't use that as the governing body for the disarmament treaty, because one of them can cheat and then veto any action against it. But the signatories to the treaty could establish its own governing mechanism, and including in that the commitment, if necessary, to use conventional military power against a cheater or a potential cheater or a country who's been found to be planning to cheat on an agreement. And the collective use of force is an essential part of any eventual disarmament. To make this happen, get beyond, I think, getting the next U.S.-Russia treaty, there's a lot of problems, but it's, it's certainly within the realm of the possible. Disarmament is still a further reach, although the way people talk about it now in Washington is completely different than they did before President Obama made a statement. It's now a legitimate policy option, something you could talk about legitimately. But there are some myths that need to be erased. The first one, and there's a man named Ward Wilson who has done wonderful work in eliminating this myth, and this is the basis of the whole belief, not only in this country, but in many countries, about the need for nuclear weapons, and that's the Hiroshima myth. And the myth is that the United States built these atomic bombs, dropped 2 on Japan, and won the war, and saved thousands of American lives because we did not have to invade Japan. Turns out it's not true. It was a myth that was established because it served everyone's interest, the Japanese interest and the American interest. When the bomb was dropped on, and Wilson has done this research looking at the diaries of Japanese decision makers and the records of the Supreme Council and Japanese decision-making bodies that are now available. The U.S. had destroyed more than 60 Japanese cities before Hiroshima. It's like it wasn't a big deal. And it was a terrible thing, but the Japanese government was not willing to stop fighting because of it. The firebombing of Tokyo in April, killed many more people than were killed in Hiroshima. And yet the Japanese continued to fight. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and the Prime Minister inquired, or someone inquired of the Prime Minister, should we call a meeting of the Supreme Council? The Americans have this new weapon that just did this terrible damage in Hiroshima. And they said, no, we don't need to discuss it. Too bad we lost another city. What's important is our diplomatic initiative through the Russians to try to negotiate a peace with the West. They had asked Stalin to intervene with the U.S. and Great Britain to negotiate a treaty that would be on more favorable terms than if they simply surrendered. So on August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, 2 days passed, they didn't have a meeting of the Supreme Council. On August 8th, they learned that not only was Stalin not willing to negotiate for them with the West, but he was declaring war on Japan. And in fact, Russian armies, Soviet armies, were already invading Manchuria and the Japanese northern islands. So they now faced the prospect, and their armies were deployed in the south and east against an expected U.S. invasion. North was practically undefended. The Russians were making rapid progress. They faced the prospect of Russian occupation, much worse than an American occupation from their perspective. So they started meeting the night of August 8th, the day before Nagasaki. The Supreme Council was meeting at the time the atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki and had already reached the decision to surrender. But yet there's this myth that the atomic bomb won the war and saved all these lives. And that's been the start of this belief, this myth that we need nuclear weapons to protect our security. And it's simply not true. Wars are not won by killing civilians. And that's all that nuclear weapons do. They can destroy cities, they can kill lots and lots of people in many ways. They're terrible things, but they can't win wars. They're inefficient weapons. During the Gulf War, there was a calculation done, how many nuclear weapons would it take to stop one of the Iraqi armored divisions, if that became necessary? 40 was the answer. 40 of the so-called tactical weapons. That's inefficient. You could do it with precision-guided conventional munitions, much more efficiently without radiating the entire countryside and making it impossible for your own forces to conduct. So they're not weapons of wars. They're just terror weapons and weapons to destroy civilians, and wars are not won that way. Think of our Civil War. In the Civil War, the North destroyed Atlanta. The Confederacy kept fighting. The North occupied Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. The South kept fighting. The South surrendered only when its armies were surrounded at Appomattox. That's when they surrendered. Wars are won when armies are defeated. Nuclear weapons cannot defeat armies. They can only kill civilians. So that myth needs to, and I'm so grateful to Mr. Wilson. His work's been published in academic journals, but he has a new book coming out called 5 Myths of Nuclear Weapons, which hopefully will get a much more popular, find a much more popular audience. So I've talked long enough. I'd like to hear your questions. The important thing to keep in mind is eliminating nuclear weapons does not require transforming the world. People who oppose disarmament say, oh, we can't eliminate that until we transform the international system. That's code word for world government, which is code word for it ain't going to happen. You don't have to transform the world. There are a discrete number of very difficult but resolvable problems that need to be solved. And most importantly, people have to recognize that nuclear weapons pose grave dangers but do you no good. So if anything comes out of the Israeli-Iranian situation, maybe it'll be the understanding that nuclear weapons certainly isn't doing Israel any good in that situation. Let me open the floor.